Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the fourth webinar in our Building Mentally Healthy Workplaces series. I'm coming to you today from Wurundjeri country, and I would like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of this land and all the lands that you are meeting us from today. My name's Adrian Panozzo, and I'm the Project Manager for CCF Victoria's Positive Plans, Positive Futures project, which is a WorkWell funded project looking at developing mentally healthy workplaces in construction. We're thrilled to have you here today, and today's speakers have got a lot of content, but they've also got some great stories about the work they've been doing across their industries, and I'm excited to have them here with us today. They're working in industries that aren't typical, and if you think about you spend a third of your time at work, and during COVID, we've certainly seen the work from home transition and the changes with all office procedures and protocols. But what if your workplace was not the standard office? What if your workplace was on a bike? What if your workplace was in a bus or a train or a delivery truck driving long stretches throughout regional Victoria? These are some of the workplaces that the people we have with us today have been working in, and I'm really excited to introduce them to you now. First of all, Eliza Cooper. Eliza is the consultant psychologist at Communicorp Group, who is running the Postal Network Outreach Project. Good morning, Eliza.
Morning, Adrian. Thanks for having me.
Next, I have Dr. Nicholas Duck, Head of Opposite, who is running the Simplified Project. Good morning and hello, Nick.
Hi, Adrian. Thanks for the invitation.
And last but certainly not least, we've got Rachel Palmer, the Senior Consultant at Transitioning Well, who is running the Ageing Workforce Ready project. Good morning to you, Rachel.
Good morning, Adrian. It's good to be here.
Look, first thing I'd like to ask our speakers today is a little bit about the workplaces you're working in. I've already alluded to that you're not your traditional 9 to 5 office environments. So maybe first, Eliza, if you can give us just an overview of the workplace environment that you're working with and what it meant to be mentally healthy in that workplace.
Yeah, absolutely, Adrian. So we were very fortunate to get some WorkWell funding to support the postal sector. So we partnered with Australia Post and looking after their extended workforce. So their delivery drivers out there delivering all of your packages through lockdowns, and also their retail staff. So the post office operators, licensee post officers at your local post office. So two quite different populations, but really thinking about what mental health means for this target group. Our delivery drivers, it really was an afterthought. Their focus is on the operational side of delivering parcels, and especially in COVID, seeing huge volumes through the system. Mental health really didn't get much of the attention. For the retailers, that was a little bit more advanced in their maturity when it comes to workplace mental health. And that's probably off the back of Australia Post doing a fair bit of work, especially in the aggressive customer space, and thinking about that as one of their hazards in their workforce. But really a lot of work for us to do, and certainly a lot of challenges given the volumes that Australia Post has seen in the past 18 months.
Thanks, Eliza. I'm really keen to hear a bit more about the actual engagement and what you did. But you, Nick, tell us a little bit about the environment that you've been working in around trying to create a mentally healthy workplace.
So our project is looking at the relationship between complexity and mental health. So as workplaces become more complex, is that having a toll on our mental health? So we're interested in looking at workplaces with high levels of complexity. And so we targeted 2 control rooms, a train control room and an electrical asset management control room, 2 highly complex environments, because if they don't work, the trains don't run and people don't get power to their homes. And the control rooms actually do have a pretty good understanding already about mental health and health risk, in part because they do shift work and they're very familiar with issues related to fatigue and the impact it has on their overall physical health as well. So there is actually a strong relationship between shift work and mental health. So people who do shift work tend to have higher levels of mental health issues. And interestingly, the International Agency for Research into Cancers are now finding a link between shift work and cancers. So it's considered a probable carcinogen. So not only does it have an impact on mental health, but potentially the type of work that people do in control rooms could also have an impact on their physical health.
Thanks, Nick. That sounds really interesting. And now to you, Rachel. You're working in some interesting places, if we can call them offices, and also at a particular age profile. So perhaps you can share a little bit about that.
Yes, I was working across the bus and tram industry. So, and a great variety of different organisations, right from sort of your small 70 employee family owned business right through to the likes of Transdev and CDC, which are multinational companies really owned sort of, by overseas. So huge variety. And it was great to kind of get that insight. I think, going into this, there was an awareness of mental health. It's a predominantly male profile. So, awareness around some of the gender-based sort of differences around mental health and things like customer aggression is, frequently experienced. So, certainly some awareness, but as you said, we were particularly looking at ageing workforce and transition to retirement. And we're finding that, even though the average age in those industries is around the 55-year-old mark, which is, definitely that ageing workforce profile, they hadn't given a lot of thought to the specific, mental health considerations of that age group.
Thanks, Rachel. And look, I know in the industry that I'm working in construction, there's been a long history of very focused work around physical safety. It's a tangible thing, and there's good measurement and there's good risk and controls. But when you talk about mental health, and particularly in the workplace, for a lot of people, they say, well, I can't see it and I'm not qualified to do anything about it. And there's a lot of work we know being done around awareness, and that can actually divide people. People who might have lived experience or people who might really want to do something proactive about it, they're really keen to get in there and try some of the solutions that you're working on. But we also know for some people it creates a bit of a fear. But what we do know is the issue of mental health in the workplace is not going to go away. I know with WorkSafe, some of the background work they're doing, there's been a steady increase in mental health claims in recent years. And we think over the next 10 years, that could end up being around a third of all claims being related to mental health. Now, in my project, we're focusing on prevention. And the idea around that is to really, let's put a fence at the top of the cliff. Let's stop people getting unwell due to work, because we know work is a place of meaning and purpose. And I'm sure for all three of you, you did find that meaning and purpose in your workplaces. And I'd be really keen to see not just what you saw that would cause mental injury, but maybe starting with you, with Eliza, what did you do to get in and engage with the workers? What strategies did you use?
Yeah, I think, Adrian, that engagement piece is so critical, and actually getting out there and speaking to your target population and understanding what a day's work looks like for them. Because whilst we had some ideas to start with around what were those kind of hazards or psychosocial factors that would impact them the most, it wasn't exactly what we thought it would be. So that engagement piece was so critical. COVID definitely put a spanner in the works there, especially for our LPOs, who are 800 of them in Victoria, completely dispersed around the state. So getting out and actually speaking to LPOs was a challenge. For our delivery drivers, we sort of, in the midst of, multiple lockdowns, when we weren't in lockdown, we got out there and visited depots early in the morning before they start, and really chatted to them and tried to unpack, what were those challenges. And I think that the common one across both of our populations was that job demands piece, and really the pressure and, the fatigue as well. Some of these employees working 7 days a week to clear volumes in the system. So really, where is that opportunity for rest and recovery, or to, engage in self-care or look after themselves? It really wasn't possible. So we had to be quite creative, but think about some of those protective factors as well. So that was interesting that you're touching on that, Adrian. A lot of the time we think about hazards in the workplace, but what about some of those protective factors that we can build on as well?
I'm interested. Look, my experience with my post is he rocks around about 10 o'clock, he or she, the parcel delivery driver, 1, 2, 3 o'clock. When you talked about meeting them where they were at, what sort of hours of engagement? How early are we talking and how late were we talking during the project?
For our drivers, it was early. They would have wanted me out there for a 5 a.m. session before they get going at sort of 5:30, 5:45. And I think that, if I can do that for a couple of days, certainly gave me good insight into that's there every day. So, I was happy to go out there and visit some of these depots and run kind of just awareness sessions on the project to get that initial buy-in. For our LPOs, that was late at night because they are running their business every day. So we would do sort of 6:30 at night kind of Zoom sessions. Luckily, from COVID, their managers had kind of gotten them on board in terms of the tech, so we could do those late at night sessions with them.
Yeah, it's a good point you make, Eliza. You said you only had to do it a few times, but I wonder as leaders and managers and supervisors whether we build into the rhythm of our work to actually physically show up to all areas of our business, because we know, and we'll look at it a bit later in this session, the work-related factors, that things like support and the job demands that cause fatigue and reward and recognition are really important. And that culture of leaders showing up and being present, I think, is really important. Now, for you, Nick, you talking about complex environments, you just probably want to just go into a bit more detail around that and perhaps how you sought to engage the cohorts that you were working with.
Yeah, Adrian. So probably similar to Eliza, you've got frontline workers who are really busy. They're focused on actually just getting their job done. And then you throw in the COVID pandemic and everyone's distracted and people don't have a lot of time and a lot of headspace. So it's probably one of the more difficult times to implement a program. So dealing with a complex environment and you throw in another extraordinary complexity on top of it. So in terms of the train control, before the pandemic at least, they have, this is metro trains, they usually have about 400,000 passengers they have to get through the system every day. So there's very little time for anything extraneous to operations. For Gemini, they're powering something like 350,000 homes. So any sort of disruption can have an impact on whether you can turn your lights on. So their primary focus in these environments is just keeping the trains running, keeping the energy running, and any other kind of distraction is a distraction basically. But if you consider that they also have to deal with like emergencies. So people getting hit by trains potentially, electricity is a major safety risk as well. Then you also have to consider it's a safety critical industry. So it's not something that they can slow down and stop or just put things on hold for a few weeks and then fix their systems and processes or any kind of complications they have in their day-to-day life. There's no opportunity just to shut things down. You basically have to make improvements whilst you're keeping everything running. And that's where a lot of the complexity comes in. And I think where there's a huge mental toll on people because they don't have the luxury like many of us in, say, office work to be able to say, oh, that's fine, let's just postpone and let's just do that on Monday or let's get that report in a bit later. If there's a problem, they have to attend to it immediately. And if there's an emergency, it's all hands on deck. And it can be quite, Eliza was talking about job demands. It's probably one of those organisations or industries in the control room setting where job demands are probably as high as they'll ever be.
Thanks, Nick. And not only job demands, but we know that well-managed change allows people to thrive in work. But obviously, inversely, poorly managed change can be a real driver of work-related stress. So, I mean, I assume you had to be really agile and in some of the ways that you went about your work. And I think you have an engineering background. So was it about trying to mix all those things together, the processes that were really important to drive safety, but you just can't leave things as they are if people are getting stressed?
Yeah, indeed. So basically, the real key to this project is it's called Project Simplify. So what we're trying to do is help remove complexity. That's one thing. But the way we go about it as well, we have to also be as simple as possible. So in many ways, as we're engaging, so we ideally, when we start a project like this, we like to sit down with someone and really understand their role. Like it might even just be sitting down and observing their role and the sort of tasks that they do. But during the pandemic, you couldn't do that. So we had to adapt all the way through. And it was only just recently when we realised that actually adopting the same principle of simplify actually should apply to us as well. And so we had to continue to adapt and change our approach and simplify that approach in how we engage with people. So that meant working around their schedules a bit more, carving things up into smaller bite-sized pieces to be able to get them to actually, engage with material or ideas. And so I guess in many ways, opposite as in my business who've been implementing this project, we've had to also learn from it as well. And so I think it's been really valuable for us, and recognising that we can also overcomplicate things and make things too complex in how we approach things. So fortunately, there's some lessons learned for us as well. But that said, I think the idea of it is that you can sort of always put things on the back burner. So you could always say, well, control room's so complex. We just have to react indefinitely. But the intention of our project, and I think for the other two projects as well, is to say, you know what, if we just slow down and look at how we can do things a little bit better, then actually we can remove some of those stresses and that complexity that distracts you from making the improvements in the first place.
Thanks, Nick. Rachel, I'm really keen to hear about the people you worked with in your environment. I'm what you'd call a middle-aged angry man, losing patience and growing frustrated with things. And I'm not saying that was the sort of people that you worked with, but yeah, really keen to hear about what was going on in the buses and trains during COVID in your project.
Well, as long as you're not an angry man on the buses, they have enough to deal with customer aggression. So, look, like Eliza and Nick, that we use that co-design process and absolutely had to, adapt all the way through COVID as well. So, lots of surprises and challenges, but that co-design, that conversation, so important. And I think it actually relates to, one of those mentally healthy work-related factors as well in itself, the actual design of the project. So, job control is so important. We know that links to mental health. And I found just by having the focus groups, just by talking to older people, they loved the conversation. They loved talking about well-being. For many of them, they'd never really thought about well-being in like career and retirement. It's all about, do I have enough money to retire or to have the lifestyle I want? So really important to have those conversations, and we know, ARI and Australian Human Rights Commission did some great research. They do it every few years and released another report at the start of this year. That only a third of employers, talk to older workers about what they need at work. So, simply having those conversations was immensely helpful for them and for the project. The other thing that we really learnt was, building capability, allowing, leaders to have the skills and the insights that they need to provide that support is so important. And that comes back, Adrian, to what you were saying about, that proactivity. I mean, we heard a variety of stories as we talked to leaders and employees. So, for example, there was a story we were told about, that really reactive, leaving issues around, aging, workforce and what happens naturally as we get older, and leaving that to be reactive, leaving that as a performance management issue. So waiting until, there's extra scratches down the side of the bus, or they turn the wrong way into the lane and then responding as a performance management issue, where we want people to be proactive. And that's a lot of what we did. We heard other examples, like Kevin up in one of the regional depots, where the leaders had been proactive. They talked to him. They realised he was getting older. He couldn't do the long haul, trips to Melbourne anymore. But he was still engaged. He loved his work. He didn't want to stop working. So they were very creative about adapting his work and putting in place place, those formal, work adaptions so that he could continue to work. So it was great sort of hearing, that different experience, different examples, and sharing them across the different companies, because, bus companies, as a rule, don't often get to talk to each other and share those good stories. So it was wonderful being part of that.
Yeah, and I think you raised a good insight, and correct me if I'm not accurately reflecting what you were saying, but it seems like there's this almost fear. People are scared to have a conversation that we know we have to have. Like, today's young managers, they're going to be older age workers before they know it. And I know in construction, you talked about Kevin was changing up his workloads. In construction, the work can be really hard, and particularly in summer. And we've seen similar interventions where older workers are offered shorter shifts, or in one case, one guy even took extended leave during summer. And the boss that I spoke to said, look, it extended his work life by 3 or 4 years.
Yeah.
But he was also a great mentor. He had a lot of knowledge and wisdom, because we also see that in workplaces that, with the emergence of technology and recruiting into industries, old people can sometimes be pushed aside, and that can be really stressful for them when they know they've got a lot to add. And I remember in one business, a group of older guys said, look, the boss just thanks the young guys for turning up, but if there's anything ever hard to be done, he's the first to ask us. So it seems like this, almost like this need to get to know each other, not just professionally, but personally, and understand ways to communicate with each other. I love the fact that you've used the word co-design, Rachel. And you've all alluded to these work-related factors. And I know that all our projects have been focused around, there's 11 of them that have been defined by WorkSafe. And I think it might be timely to show that slide. And for those of us on the webinar today, perhaps drop into the chat. Is there anything about your workplace that you're doing really well around managing the work-related factors? Is there anything that you've heard today that is similar to your experience in the workplace, trying to manage those work-related factors? We've heard Nick talk about complexity. Now, that can have impacts on control. It can mean you might need appropriate levels of support. That might need you need appropriate clarity. Who does what, where, and when? If I need help, who do I go to? I'm told to use my initiative, but am I really able to use my initiative, or every time I use my initiative, am I micromanaged? How is conflict dealt with? I think, Rachel, you spoke about customer engagement and conflict. And also, Eliza, you talked about the posties. I've been in post offices and I've seen people berating the person on the counter when really they're a long way away from the supply chain of actually getting the post there. So those 11 work-related factors, what they do, they give us a real focus around where to target our interventions. And the WorkWell toolkit, which we'll have information about later, provides us with a survey tool. And so if I could come back to you, Eliza, perhaps some of the more focused work, and what did you find around the work-related factors, and did you come up with any solutions?
Yeah, absolutely, Adrian. So we ran a survey, but we also did some one-on-one interviews to really get some more qualitative data around what were those challenges and what did that look like from, a more detailed kind of scenario situation. And what we found was job demands absolutely was a real challenge, but also one that came up in both of the post offices and the drivers was around communication and change in the workplace. And there certainly had been a lot of change in COVID, but also, system updates, process updates, changes in technology, scanners, things like that. And that creating quite a headache for some of these workers when, they're already trying to deal with the pressure, and then there's more things on top of that, to Nick's point, just adds further complexity to their operational day-to-day. We also looked at some of those protective factors as well, what was working well. And we found in both the drivers and the post offices that there was this real sense of community, which was great to see, and a real kind of motivation for this work, and also relationships as well, being a real protective factor, both relationships with colleagues, but also relationships with customers, and people really having a great sense of pride being able to service their customers. So looking at that, we then went into our co-design phase and we ran two half-day workshops with a group of our sort of key stakeholders, our working group. LPOs themselves, drivers, but also some key stakeholders from within Australia Post, from their safety team, wellbeing team, managers, to really get their ideas on, well, how do we address these factors? Because I can sit here and try and come up with solutions, but they're probably not going to be the best and work in their kind of operational sense. So going into that co-design phase without kind of preconceived assumptions or ideas around what that would look like was really, really important, and certainly came up with new things that I had never thought about, which was really exciting. And we actually brought in an external facilitator to run those sessions. So it was a new face that could really remove any bias around that co-design process.
Thanks, Eliza. Nick, I'm going to state the obvious here. Simplified by nature, is that what you went in and did? Or because we know in workplaces that people are worried that if you're going to talk about mental health, you're going to actually ask you to do more and add things and make my life even more stressful when you're trying to tell me that you're going to make my life easier. So how did you go about that?
Yeah, exactly right. And I think that's the main thing, is that quite often when there are problems, we go in and we say we need to do more training or we need to do something additional. And certainly with complexity, we think one of the root causes or one of the problems we have is that if there is a particular problem within a workplace, new operational processes and procedures are usually added. Sometimes new systems are introduced as well, like new IT systems. And then, of course, we also add more people to solve the problem as well, and we create new structures and new teams. And so it's a tendency, I think it's a human tendency to perhaps add more and do more to fix problems. And so what this project actually does is looks at what you're currently doing. Is there a way we can, in some ways, do less or do it better than what we used to do? So as an example, for both organisations we worked with, the ultimate solution that we co-designed, so similar to Eliza, we worked with the organisations and actually had a discussion about what would actually improve their areas of complexity. The first thing we did is we developed a comprehensive assessment tool that looks at complexity. So that tool was based on peer-reviewed research. It also basically called the elephant in the room, and it actually it pointed out all those things that lead to people finding that their job is very demanding or overly complex, or communication breakdowns are occurring because of these particular issues. And what it helps do is, first of all, it helps you grade the level of complexity in your workplace. So if you get like a score of 100%, it basically means it's chaos. Then hopefully there are no organisations out there like that. For the organisations we worked with, the scores they were getting were closer to just under 50%, which kind of meant about half of the observations that people were recording were indicating that we're doing things way too complicated to what we should be doing. Oh. And basically what we did was we co-designed a couple of little solutions which are currently in prototype mode, and they're primarily focused on improving workflows, providing greater access to information, and also creating a more usable interface for searching and finding information to ultimately help decision making and improve the execution of day-to-day processes that would otherwise be more bureaucratic and more administratively heavy.
Thanks, Nick. Now, Rachel, I'm a day closer to retirement today compared to yesterday. We're all thinking about transitioning. We're talking about the great resignation. So people are clearly reflecting on work and its meaning. Have you come up with any strategies, or you're looking at things that we can implement? And what have you tried with these retiring, semi-retiring bus drivers, train drivers?
Yeah, so we really looked at it on three levels. So as you say, if we're lucky, we all get old, and so one thing that we really and I became particularly aware of through COVID is this ageism. I mean, we have ageism in our society. It's like, well, we've addressed, gender to, some extent, long way to go. Racism, ableism, but it's still like ageism is still okay, and it really shouldn't be. So, one part of our project was very much about raising awareness with managers, with HR practitioners, and also, through social media. And one great story that one of the pilot organisations shared with me just the other day actually was, she wasn't able to implement, all the bits and pieces that we designed, and I'll go into those in a moment. But she had this increased awareness and was recruiting for a role, and they decided, they would recruit Rob. Rob was a guy that they wouldn't normally consider. He was a bit too close, to that traditional retirement age, and usually they would, overlook and go to the next person because of all of their inbuilt stereotypes and assumptions, about what Rob would be like. But, they've done some conversations with us and had that mindset, and they gave him a go. And he's been amazing. He's now one of the busiest guys in the depot, and they have this catch cry, that they need another Rob. So, just that awareness goes a long way. In addition, the project was looking at, as I said, that capability. So training managers, giving them the skills, the insights to have those tricky conversations. You can't just walk up to someone on their 65th birthday and say, well, are you thinking about retirement? There's a lead up to that. There's a skill to having that conversation. And so, we worked with managers around, how do you have that in a really respectful and productive and proactive way? The other thing that we've been looking at is that systems. We don't want to, give everything that training, as Nick said. It doesn't all come down to training, and often we don't have the time that we need for training. So we were looking at how do we embed some of, the interventions in the systems, in policy, in metrics, in reporting, in some of those symbols in the organisation. So really did take those three levels of intervention and support organisations to try out different things, as it suited them.
That's great, Rachel. And thanks for those on the webinar who are putting some questions and comments through. We will certainly get to as many of those as we can. And one that's come up a bit is fatigue. And I'm just going to assume it's important in construction. So we have shift work and obviously jobs that are really physical, but the critical thing is safety, right? And I assume in all the industries you've described, whether Rachel's sorting the mail, making sure parcels get to the right place, Nick making sure trains don't run into each other, and transport and logistics critical. What role does fatigue play, and how does it link to mental stress, I suppose, and decision making? Perhaps to you, Eliza.
Yeah, I think it is critical. I think for us, for the fatigue management piece was strong and something that certainly for our drivers they were very familiar with, and there is sort of very historical kind of process and policy around that. So I think we actually used it as a strength to piggyback off in terms of, they were familiar with toolbox talks to talk about physical safety. There was, not so much now, but there was a big kind of push from Australia Post around dog attacks and how they could change the way they operate to manage that physical risk. And I think that that's the same with fatigue, that the organisation has looked at what they can do to manage that, which is wonderful. And that's why I think when we think about mental health, how can we take the same approach? This is the risk. Well, how can we take that systematic, sustainable approach to managing that risk?
And thanks, Eliza. What about you, Nick? Those human factors, I don't know that it's the same, but it sounds like you're running in like an air traffic controller hub over a rail yard and trains going everywhere. And, there's a lot of decisions to make. I assume it's not all driven by technology. And, if you get tired, is that a risk in the industry you were working in?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, shift workers, and you have to pay very close attention all the time. So it's not only fatigue in getting rest when your sleep schedule's disrupted.
Yes.
There's fatigue on the job. And actually, we're doing getting physiological recordings from small samples from each organisation. using basically like a Fitbit. It's an Oura ring, so it's I'm actually wearing on now, but it actually measures sleep and also recovery from sleep after you've had a good night's sleep, or if not, or otherwise. And it looks at resting heart rate and other things as well. And so one of the things we will be evaluating as part of the project is there a relationship between mental health and this data that we get, so the actual biofeedback data? And also, is there a relationship between those physiological responses and those perceptions of complexity? So we already found in very early data that there is actually a relationship between perceptions of complexity and mental health and well-being. So as people thought that their job was more complex, they tended to report a diminished well-being. So it'll be very interesting, I think, to see whether or not there's also a relationship between those physical measures as well. So people who are sleepy and fatigued, do they also think their job is way too complex, and vice versa? Yeah.
And look, I don't think it's drawing too long a bow, Nick, but it's then how do people self-medicate, self-manage, what'd you have for morning tea? I had a double espresso and an energy drink to get me through to the next session, and diet and those sorts of things. So, Rachel, we've had a question come through around the ageism. So maybe just want to explore that a little bit more for us. And is there any particular research or any key factors around that you're bringing out in the work that you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, you're going to get me on my little hobby horse in a minute. I could talk for ages about ageism, and it's something as well. It's been really confronting, through COVID. Maybe less so in Australia, but some of the overt ageism that's come out, from America and other countries, around how we manage COVID has been really, really confronting. And there is so much incorrect information, out there, around older people and technology. If we talk about older workforce, being 45, 50 plus, we're talking multiple generations, huge variation in what that aging worker looks like. To say that they can't, use technology is incorrect. And then there's all this complexity about, what's easier to develop? Do you want to develop people's, use on the latest, IT doodad, or do you need to develop their emotional intelligence? And technical skills are much easier to train, even if you do buy into that stereotype. We know, and this is research, that older people, they tend to have, better emotional intelligence, higher resilience. They bring that wisdom. They're not all the grumpy old men that you talked about before. In fact, not many of them are. But there's so much. So what we did was, we've got 5 very commonly held myths around older workers, and we've gone out and attacked them head on. There's data. Older people do not take more sick leave. They're not just coasting down to retirement. They still want to take pride in their work. They have skills to offer. They have things that they want to achieve. They have a legacy they want to leave, and they take sick leave differently. So, there's, like I said, I could keep going on and on. I'll stop there. But we really do need to address that incorrect information, because it impacts, mental health. If people can't get looking for jobs, and we know that, there's a huge number of organisations that won't consider, officially or unofficially employing people over 50. And, if you're over 50, you could work for another 20 years and you can't get a job. What's that going to do for your mental health?
Look, they're great insights you picked up, Rachel. And again, speaking to my comment now, but it seems like there's a lot of stigma and there's a lot of barriers around cohorts that aren't included. So not just age, but around ability or disability, gender, culture. If an industry doesn't provide pathways for diversity, then they're basically putting up brick walls. And, we know that in Australia there's skill shortages, there's labour shortages. And if we're going to maintain productivity, and that came up in one of the questions as well, we're going to need people who not just have an appetite to work, but are motivated because they know they're going to be accepted and included. So, really want to thank you on that work you've done there. In terms of We've had another comment come up in here, and people wanting to know how, from an IT point of view, so using technology, how can they support mental health in heavy transport? Don't know if anyone wants to speak into that around heavy transport. What's any technological interventions or compliance-based work that's been done?
So that's in regards to using technology to, I guess, broadcast or to get into contact with people working in heavy transport.
Look, it might be both, Nick. I know, there's been the rise of monitoring and driver monitoring and those sorts of things. You spoke about the physiological monitoring and that sort of stuff. We just had a comment there. If you don't have anything specific into it, the good thing is this webinar is being recorded today. It will be up on the WorkSafe website shortly after this. And I think also we're going to have the details for all of our speakers today who will be placed up. So if you wanted to get in contact with any of the people today who have spiked your interest or you want to build a connection with them, we'll have their details up as well. Eliza, I know in construction there has been some circulars go out that they won't be asking for tender submissions, and they're going to have an extended break over Christmas to give everyone a break. Imagine you're coming into Christmas and the last thing you need is to fill in this 100-page tender and you're not going to find out till February anyway. Is there anything particular being done in the postal area around these high-pressure times? And my sense is it's on all the time at the moment, but is there anything being done around managing those peak workloads and times?
Yeah, it's an interesting one, Adrian, because in the world of Australia Post, they talk about peak periods and peak and working up to peak, but peak doesn't exist anymore for them. Peak is always. So normally sort of by late October is kind of tools down for any kind of other operational big change pieces, and it's just all hands on deck managing the Christmas period. And then there'll be other peaks throughout the year, whether that's Mother's Day, Father's Day, kind of those Black Friday sales. But Christmas is the busy period. But really, it's just been the past 18 months of that, even higher than it normally would be over Christmas. So what they've done, which I'm sure people have seen, a lot of recruiting, a lot of campaigns around recruiting new staff and new drivers to work. They've also had challenges with depots having to close because of COVID cases. And then kind of the flow-on effect that then happens that then brings to their contact centre, that are then getting a huge volume of calls because people's parcel haven't arrived, and kind of very abusive phone calls to their contact centre who are trying to work out, while the parcel hasn't arrived, but they've got 5 depots that are closed in the state because of positive cases. So they've had to be very agile in terms of managing that. And honestly, hats off to them. It's been pretty amazing to have some kind of interaction with their safety team and wellbeing. But a lot of it comes down to headcount. Getting enough people on the ground to provide that, but also thinking about kind of the campaigns that they can run to, those campaigns around get your Christmas shopping done now. And I think they were coming out sort of a month ago, because they need to send the message to the community that this is out of their control. That they are doing the best they can. And a lot of that is really that communication piece from the organisation, so that it changes our perception as a customer and changes our kind of expectations as well.
Thanks, Eliza. And I think there's another comment that's come through. So not just managing customers' expectations, but if I read this comment question right in the chat, is frontline workers get it. They're doing it. They're living it. They're busy. They've got the finger on the pulse. Mm-hmm. What strategies? How can they go to management? I think it would be tough. How do you have that conversation with management? What can you say? How do you approach that issue when you know that the work-related factors, you might not know them by name, but you're experiencing them? Has anyone got any strategies around how do you approach management for more support, more resources? How do you provide that feedback?
Yeah, I'd probably turn it around a bit, Adrian, and say I think, especially for those listening today, it almost What we're trying to target is management, because it is very difficult for a frontline worker to actually escalate and what would be perceived as a complaint or a whinge or something like that. What we're really trying to do is actually change the conversation to say, well, look, managers and supervisors and senior leaders, they can actually look at how they can improve the workplace conditions and the systems, the processes and the structures, so that we don't put it on the individual, we don't put it on that individual frontline worker to have to put their hand up and say, this isn't good enough, I need better working conditions. I think for too long it's been flipped the other way. So I perhaps wouldn't be offering what should a frontline worker do. I'd be sort of promoting, at least in this webinar and the projects that we're doing, is what can we do as people who are decision makers who can actually bring about a more sustainable and fundamental change.
I'd completely agree with Nick, and that's sort of in our project. We went in talking about retirement, but we've actually ended up talking about late career and retirement, and that is really, in a very practical way, extending that conversation. So you're building the trust. It isn't just suddenly, at retirement we're having this conversation about people's well-being or what they need, or raising issues and problems that kind of affect mental health. But we're setting that as the culture, as the tone that right from when they start in the organisation, they can talk about their careers more generally. So there is that two-way conversation that Nick's talking about. And it was great when we introduced this idea with HR people from our pilot organisations. It was a great energy. It was real excitement about, actually this is right. If we talk about this stuff and make it normal, then the retirement conversations are going to be so much easier.
Thanks, Rachel. And look, I know in construction, so our project with CCF Victoria, we talk about having that conversation of possibility, right? Because in construction, they're problem solvers. They love working things out. They love tackling plans and implementing, and they're creators. Right? They can create things, and they can bring resources together in really creative ways, build things. And I suppose language and how you have that conversation in context is really important. And I know that in our project Positive Plans, Positive Futures, the other thing we've spoken about is things change. It's going to be inevitable. And we've talked about capability, and every business in construction, and I assume it's the same in your industries, they market their capabilities. It could be their people or their plant, their equipment, their processes. And so we've challenged our industry to say, imagine the day when a manager, a workplace, an organisation sees mental health as a capability, because the conversation's always going to be challenging. We can't always predict the outcome, and we often can't manage the outcome. So that focus on and around capability is really important. Before we finish up, I want to anchor us back in some of the work-related factors, because we're getting some questions and comments coming through. I don't know if it was an impact that any of you saw, but we have had a comment come through around isolated remote workers. So how do they get connection? How do they raise issues? And I think along that similar line is the time to debrief, the time to actually step back. You've all explained busy works. You're midway through a bus trip, Rachel, so you can't just stop the bus and step off. How do we handle that debrief or that recovery period so that we can actually become not just physically refreshed, but mentally and emotionally refreshed? Anyone want to speak into that?
I can jump in, Adrian, about the remote and isolated piece. I think that that came up in our LPOs, especially those that are in regional Victoria. Some of these post offices might be, one or a few other shops, and that's the town. And so they're really kind of rural, small areas. They might not get a lot of traffic, very different to kind of metro Melbourne post offices. And they might not have any interaction with other post offices in the state because they are effectively running their small business. So thinking about how we can kind of overcome that remoteness was we created a mentoring program within our LPO network to enhance some of that community feel, but between the different LPOs. And we saw really, wonderful feedback coming through, matching some of the LPOs that have been doing it for 40 years with some that have just started in the midst of COVID, and really just building a friendship, but also being able to provide some of that career development and some strategies and support around the job demands, for example. So that kind of remote work is something that we can tackle with technology, and really thinking about how we can connect people in and use FaceTime, all of the kind of different tech available to enhance that was really cool.
Thanks. Look, there's some people who they're really keen for strategies. I think they're going to take advantage of you being here today, and it's coming up again. So obviously people want to talk about it. They want to hear about it. How do we encourage positive mental health when we're flat out busy? So Eliza, you've just spoken about Christmas coming up, but peak periods, people are mentioning Christmas, but what can we do to encourage positive mental health when people are busy?
Yeah, I think it's about not seeing it as an extra, but actually seeing it as something that will enhance how we work. It's actually going to help us get the operational side of work done better, because we're going to be more productive. We're not going to make those same mistakes. I see it when fatigue increases in the postal sector, more car accidents, more falling over because we're running to deliver the parcel instead of, taking the appropriate safety measures. So I think it's changing that mindset around we're going to have to stay back late to do this session. Well, this is actually going to help us in the long run, because we're going to be more aware around what's going on for us. So I think changing the mindset, and that all comes back to the leaders and having that buy-in as well, to really advocate for that.
Look, I know, let's call it co-design and work design. Rachel, you brought it up earlier. That's a really important strategy, I think. So if I'm not sure who's making, the comments there. Let's assume they're managers and supervisors. Consider co-design. Don't think that you have, as the manager and supervisor, have to sit there and nut it out yourself. Get in and have the conversation. Ask and trust people for their feedback. Don't promise that you can act on everything. In one of the seasonal services in construction, in summer, they do long shifts and they're busy. And what they did with their crew management is, if a crew was working a long shift, one of the other crews that they knew weren't that busy, they would actually come in and set up the truck and the plant for them. Now, it saved 20 or 30 minutes, but what it did, the morale and the motivation that went through the business, because you knew if you were doing a long shift that other people knew because they were prepared to help out, and that reciprocity. So I don't know whether you've come up with anything within the transport industry, Rachel, but that co-design process, it's really important, isn't it?
Yeah. And look, no one's saying this is easy. I mean, we all work in mental health, and, we're pretty busy. So we're kind of living it as well at the moment. So, and it's certainly, it's tough. I think the things I would say, absolutely, as Eliza was saying, I mean, build it in, take that courageous step just to, as a leader, to stop and look and listen and have that conversation. One of my favourite sort of catch cries is, barbecues don't fix culture. You can't say work now and, Boxing Day we'll have a barbecue and everything will be better. We'll fix mental health, next year. You got to address it now and have that courage just to stop, breathe and listen, and not wait.
It's a great point you make, Rachel, because not only that, with leadership, and there's a lot of models but isn't it funny they call them soft skills, and the perception, particularly in a gendered industry like construction, harden up, take a spoonful of concrete, or, if you show too much empathy, you're being soft, you don't want to let them get one over you. So, when I think about it, it does come back to leadership and culture, but there are ways to go about it. And I think that's the great thing about the Work Well toolkit. It's supported all of our projects to actually have a framework and an intervention. And I think it constantly brings you back to those work-related factors, and it anchors you in focusing on understanding what causes stress within the workplace and then doing something about it. Now, I hope this is not an unfair way to end today's webinar. One thing, is there one thing in your project, like if you had to walk away and say, we did that, and, I think it's important that everyone should consider it or know it. And we might go in reverse because, Rachel, you've had to wait to the end and everyone else has had a good go. Your one thing, I've heard you say a few really interesting things today, but is there one thing?
Can I have two? I'll have two things.
You can have two things.
One is listen. I mean, I think I've said that over and over. So, make the time to listen to, your older workforce. I mean, all your workforce, but, I'm talking about older workforce. The other thing you can do is visit our AWR project website. We've thought long and hard about how to simplify this, not to use Nick's thunder. But, it struck me that, this ageing workforce, I first heard about it 15 years ago when I was working at NAB. And, a lot of people either don't know where to start, and even well-intentioned people that realise, the importance of this still don't know where to start. So on our website, we've created a quiz. So you go on there, do the quiz, you get a report that's tailored to, your current level of maturity. And that gives you some really practical, strategies, things to do, things to read, things to think about to get started.
Oh, I can feel you coming through. For someone who spends a lot of time around ages, and you're young and sprightly today, well, it's great to see.
Got a bit of grey hair.
But I think it's important, isn't it? It's important that we don't. I mean, mental health is a serious topic and it's a serious issue, and we don't detract from anyone's lived experience. And we understand that people can end up, dealing with the consequences. And from a work-safe point of view, anyone who experiences a mental injury, it's going to take a long time to get well, and it's going to cost a lot to get well. But if we also focus on the prevention end, then that's worthwhile too, to actually bring some energy and solutions around the work-related factors in a framework where leaders develop capability. Nick, your one thing, and because you are from Simplify, let's see if we can keep one thing.
If it's simple, oh gosh, that's so much pressure now. So I think what you were talking about before was that there actually are a lot of things people can do, but a lot of the time I don't have the headspace for it all the time, and that's the issue. So I guess the one thing for us is don't try and add more things. Look for things to remove or to simplify. And I'm just going to do a really quick plug because we're launching our Simplify app on the 3rd of December. So that's as part of this Workwell project. And it'll be completely open and available to all industry. So that's the 3rd of December. People are interested, they can hunt me down and they can come along to the free event. But basically, we've actually have developed an app to help create that headspace for people. So a toolkit that actually enables that. I guess my key point is, just don't think you have to add more to your day. You don't have to necessarily add more exercise or more time to do X, Y, and Z. It could just be, hey, there's all these things you're doing. Maybe not every single one of them is absolutely adding value or it's that important, or perhaps you're going about it in a really convoluted way. And more importantly, if you're a manager or you're a supervisor or you're somebody who makes a decision for potentially dozens or even hundreds of people, your decision about removing complexity could have a flow-on effect to hundreds, potentially thousands of people.
Thanks, Nick. I really enjoyed your contributions. I've enjoyed all your contributions. And lastly, to you, Eliza, because we are going to put all the links to your projects up at the end of the webinar. The webinar has been recorded, is going to be available shortly after through WorkSafe. So links to the Workwell program, the toolkit, and all your projects will be shown at the end. So if you are on the webinar, you can hang around to get those details. But Eliza, one thing, and we know we're going to post things early and get it done, but what's one thing?
I think one major learning for us or kind of that I would give to the audience is that engagement piece is critical. So really avoiding judgments or assumptions about what your workforce is experiencing, and you need to ask the question. And I think then off the back of that, once you've asked, you really need to ensure that you meet them at the maturity that they're at. And I think that was a bit different for our different cohorts. But to Rachel's point earlier, awareness around mental health might be the perfect place to start for your workforce. If we jump in too kind of complicated down the line, then that's just going to miss the mark. So I think assessing where you're at in terms of that readiness and maturity is also really, really important.
Thanks, Eliza. Thanks, Nick. Thanks, Rachel. And thanks everyone who's made the time to be with us today. Hopefully you've enjoyed today's session, enjoyed the contribution from all our speakers. As I said, all the links to their projects will be up after this webinar, as well as the WorkWell website and the WorkWell toolkit. But you can also ring WorkSafe's advisory service if you do have an issue that you would like to discuss. But all I can say is all the best for the upcoming Christmas holiday season, however you experience it. And hopefully you've enjoyed today's session and you can set about making small changes, simple changes in your workplace so that you can prevent mental injury and create a mentally healthy workplace and make some changes to people's lives in your industry.